And we did the town's master plan back in 2014. The number one item that people loved about living in Westminster was the town's remote area. That is imperiled by the rate of development that's been going on in town for the last 20 years. I'm going to give you some land use statistics for the town because that's what I do as a planner. Total land area, we've got 37.3 square miles translated into acres. That's about 23,000 acres of land. The state does a land use mapping effort for the entire state every 25 or 30 years. The last time they did it was around 1999. And back then, we had 17% of the town's land area developed. That's certainly gone up since then. Permanently protected land that can't be developed, it was about 31% then. Right now, it's about 32%. Land that won't be able to be built on because of environmental constraints, that's about 22%. And the remaining amount of vacant developable land back in 2000 was about 30% of the town's land area. That's certainly gone down the past 40 years. A little closer look at the land use statistics indicates that the town has lost farmland and forest land. Anyone want to make a guess as to what that land turned into? House it is. So, I've heard quite a bit of concern from the past couple of years with the rate of development in town, and I thought it might be a good idea if we had ourselves a land protection workshop to help property owners understand the benefits that come with protecting their land from development as an ongoing concern. So we were lucky enough to get a grant from the state to put on this morning's workshop. We've been working with the North County Land Trust on this. And so we might as well dig into the program. Right now, I'm going to turn it over to Jassy Bratko of the North County Land Trust. Because,
Morning, everyone. My name is Jassy Bratko, and I'm the Director of Land Protection for North County Land Trust. We're a regional land trust that covers 16 cities and towns in northern Worcester County, from Winchendon and Westminster in the west over to Townsend and Lancaster, Shirley and Ayr in the east. Our mission is to identify those lands in our service area that are the most environmentally sensitive, the most important for protection. And we do this by partnering with municipalities like the town of Westminster, the city of Fitchburg, and different state agencies, Department of Fish and Game, Department of Conservation and Recreation, and other land trusts in that area. Another part of our mission is to help members of our community understand the importance of these environmentally sensitive lands so that they understand the need to protect them from development. And we do that by offering different walks, educational walks like owl prowls and birding walks and fungi walks. And we also organize workshops such as this for landowners. And we've also done things like forestry workshops and managing invasive species. We own about 600 acres, over 600 acres of conservation land ourselves, and we have 10 conservation areas that are open to the public for pastoral recreation. And we also hold a number of conservation restrictions. And I'm going to talk a little more about what that is in a few minutes. But first of all, you're going to hear the word conservation a lot today. So what is conservation? So land that is conserved is protected forever, in perpetuity. And there are basically two ways that a landowner can do that. They can sell or donate their land in fee to a conservation or to an organization that is able to hold conservation land, such as a land trust or a municipality or a state agency. Or they can sell or donate a conservation restriction. You'll hear me refer to it later on in the day, probably as a CR. It's known in the rest of the country as a conservation easement. Massachusetts is the only state that calls it a conservation restriction. And a conservation restriction is where an owner will give up certain rights in their land but retain others. So what exactly is a conservation restriction? Well, as I just said, it's where a landowner will give up certain rights but retain ownership. When you sell a piece of land, you give up all the rights. You no longer have anything to do with it. But when you sell or donate a conservation restriction, you're only giving up a certain number of those rights. And it becomes the CR is a legal agreement between the holder of that conservation restriction, who is a land trust or a municipality or a state agency, and the owner that is recorded in the registry of deeds. And it is forever, it's in perpetuity. So some people like to think of it, land ownership, as a bundle of rights, right? A bundle of sticks. And when you own a piece of land outright, you have possession of it, you can control what happens to it, you can enjoy it, you can develop it, you can mine it. When you have a conservation restriction on your land, you give up some of those rights. You still own it, but you no longer have the right to develop it. You no longer have the right to mine it. Depending on who holds that land, they give up the right for certain other activities also. But a conservation restriction can be tailored to a great degree to individual land, what they want to see happen on their land.
Jassy, can I give a local example of a conservation restriction? You folks know the Jarman Farm? Okay, about 490 acres of their land is under conservation restriction. And what it means in their case is the Jarman family has the right to work the land for as long as they want. They just can't sell the land and have it developed.
So you retain certain rights, but you give up other rights, which you still own. And that conservation restriction goes with the property, not with the owner. So if you decide to sell that property, then it still has a conservation restriction on it for the next owner. It's a way that owners can determine what happens to their land in the future, long after they no longer own it. You can determine that you no longer want to see that land developed. You can make that decision. It's a way that landowners can access the equity in their land, some of the equity in their land, without actually selling it. And it's also a way that they can reduce their estate for future generations. They can reduce their estate back. Because after a conservation restriction is placed on the land, the value of it goes down significantly. So you've all heard the adage, I'm sure, that money doesn't grow on trees, but actually, with a conservation restriction, it does, because they have value. And the way that value is determined is an appraiser will come and value your land as if it could be developed. Then they will also put value on the land if it can no longer be developed. And the difference between the two of those is the value of the conservation restriction. So if an appraiser comes and values your parcel of land for $100,000, if it's developed, but it's only worth $20,000 with a conservation restriction on it, then the value of that conservation restriction is $80,000. 100,000 developable, 20,000 undevelopable is the CR value of $80,000. And it is the job of a land conservation person like myself to work with municipalities and state agencies and landowners to help you if you've made the decision that you would like to either sell your land for conservation or just the CR. It is our job to help you find that value. Sure.
With regards to taxation on conservation restrictions, is it taxed at the same rate as developable land, or do you receive a decreased value of the land? So that gets taxed on that value. Is there a different taxation rate on either one?
Yeah, so that can be hard to determine for assessors when they assess land. So what I always recommend the landowner to do is they put their land under conservation is to also put it under chapter 61, which I'll talk about a little bit in a few minutes, because that really directs the assessor's office as to how it should be valued, because otherwise, you know, it could vary greatly.
Has the potential to decrease the taxation.
It has the potential to decrease the taxation, but sometimes assessors don't quite know how to deal with that. So if it's under chapter, you know, it's laid out in black and white. Okay. So if you decide that you want to conserve your land, either by selling it or by selling a conservation restriction, there are a lot of ways that that can be funded. And you've heard me say you can either sell the fee or sell a conservation restriction, or you can donate it. I can always hear you saying, well, how is it going to help me if I donate it financially? Well, the state has a program called the Conservation Land Tax Credit, where an owner can get up to $75,000 if they donate their land for conservation. And you can also access federal tax credits over a period of years. There are also a lot of grants out there. There are grants that municipalities can apply for. There's the land grant, there's a drinking water supply grant. There are also grants that the land trust can apply for, conservation partnership grants. There are municipal funds that you can access if your town has the Community Preservation Act. And I know Westminster is working very hard right now to pass the Community Preservation Act in Westminster. I believe
Yes,
late April. So community preservation funds can be used to finance conservation too. There are also federal grants out there, the Forest Legacy Program. So there are ways that should should a landowner decide to conserve their land, they can work with a land conservation professional such as myself, or they can work with the municipality to see if they can access some of those funds.
I just want to add here that one of the rules of private land conservation trust to leverage private dollars against state funds. So, there are certain funding sources that let us go after them. So, it's working together and
Right, so a lot of these grants that I listed up here can be mixed and matched. You can access state funds and municipal funds and federal funds. So there are different ways to do that.
it's kind of confusing. Not going to test you later on.
So making a decision to conserve your land is difficult. It takes time because remember, this is in perpetuity, this is forever. And I know one of the reasons a lot of landowners feel that they have to sell their land for development is because they just simply can't afford to pay the taxes on it anymore. So if you hadn't made the decision yet, if you're ready to do any form of permanent conservation, you can put your land under some sort of chapter 61. How many of you here already have your land of some type? So a couple of you, but for those of you who are not familiar with it, chapter 61 is a tax break if you agree to temporarily not develop your land. It's not permanent conservation. There are three types. There's chapter 61 forestry, where you have to have 10 acres of land and agree to have a forest stewardship plan on your property. There's chapter 61A, where you have to have at least 5 acres of land and have $500, a minimum of $500 of farm income. And there's chapter 61B, where you basically just leave your land available for recreation and you receive a tax break. So all of these chapters can greatly reduce your tax burden while you still own that land.
We've got about 10% of Westminster in the chapter 61 program.
Right. In return for giving the landowner a reduced tax on their land, the municipality does retain the right of first refusal. That's the same as all of these chapters. So if you decide to sell your land for development while you're enrolled in this program, and the town does have the right of first refusal, they have to match any price that is agreed upon in the purchase and sale agreement to do so, that the town does have the right of first refusal. And there is a look back of 5 years where you would be asked to pay the rollback taxes. But if you choose to sell your land to someone who is going to keep it in the same use, that those don't apply. So for example, I bought my farm, it was under chapter 61A, I still farm it. The owner didn't have to pay rollback taxes, and the farm didn't have to right of first refusal. So this is a temporary measure.
And I was just going to do a plug for the CPA fund. I'm going to town Harvard. We have CPA, Community Preservation Act fund. And because we have a portion of it can go to conservation, so we can get a pool of money if a farm or forestry land or another chapter land is going to be sold. So maybe the town can actually purchase that. So CPA helps get those funds together.
So that is basically a little explanation of conservation, what it is. Anyone have any questions about anything that I said?
You decide someone who is in 61B decides to do something with a CR or something like that, does it still apply the right of first refusal on the rollback? about taxes?
No, the only time that the right of first refusal applies is if you sell your land for development. But if you're putting a conservation restriction on it or something like that, no. It's not apply. And if you want to sell it to someone who is going to, then it doesn't apply. Any other questions at all? So I would like to introduce you to Leigh Hudson. Leigh is a landowner who worked with North County Land Trust to conserve her land by selling it in fee, working with forest legacy grant programs and the city of Fitchburg owns, and I think this is John Deline from the city of Fitchburg. The city of Fitchburg holds a conservation restriction on her useful land to North County Land Trust with forest legacy funds, and the city of Fitchburg holds a conservation restriction on that one. So I would like to invite Leigh to come up here to explain a little bit about her experience.
Good morning, everyone. I'm not here, so what is it all about? And I want to share that, this morning's information was informative to me as well, because I don't know anything about the volume and variety of programs that are available, first of all. I guess, used to play tennis, I was director of tennis, this is for a little bit. And, a lot of varieties, I've been environmentalists, and I don't know the program. So one thing I want to emphasize about my experience is that North County Land Trust provides the front end to all the programs that we just discussed. So basically, my experience was to allow them to kind of lead the charge, and they were the ones who were able to look at my property, review all the kinds of options that were available, and lead, if you will, a whole initiative around getting stakeholders involved, informing me of what the options were, managing the entire process smoothly at my end, but certainly theirs, I'm sure, and made it just easy for me just to be someone who wanted to explore my options. And I think that's the first place that I had to start at. I didn't have a large parcel of land as a background. I have a 7-acre parcel across the street from me. The history of that basically is that when my former husband and I were looking at this area to buy to in Princeton, we found one parcel. It was nice to have a house on it, 5 acres, and a lovely brook that it also abutted. And we were deadlocked with the prior sellers. And then I found out they owned it across the street, a nice 7-acre parcel. And it was beautiful woodland, pine trees and hemlocks and scrub growing through it. So I just said, well, we'll give you full price, but give us that parcel. And they were like, okay, fine, because they had kind of been 2 years on the market and they were ready to sell. So we ended up picking up a home for one child and one away. And in a nice town that I felt wonderful about, because probably like you, I love the rural nature of where I cherish. And that's grown over the years. And it was nice also to know that this parcel across the street, I looked at it as a potential investment, saying, well, the kids will be, in college bound, hopefully, and we'll simply use that land and sell it for a college experience, right? And another way of underwriting their college experience. So that's kind of how I got into land ownership, if you will. And the parcel itself is charming, I've got to say. It's a beautiful piece of land, and that is kind of flat and accessible. It has old, like carriage car road on it, so you can travel into it. It had a beautiful road on one side with the hemlock trees. And believe it or not, it opened up onto the AT2 transcontinental pathway that runs all the way from, I guess, Canada down to Mexico. And it ended up actually providing a beautiful hiking path down to the reservoir system that joined it. The reservoirs. So as we picked up that land, maybe you all know, you start to learn about our land. You start to see its magic during each one of the seasons. Right? So we would be snowshoeing, we would be hiking for snow, we would hear the barred owls. We would explore and see scat from owls. We would see the tracks from animals. And then we began to, as the kids got even older, go on the spring explorers and see the fiddlerheads and big bays of lady slippers, right? So it became not just like a parcel, it became our private playground in a sense. And And I began to have a much greater appreciation for how unique that land was to us as like a touch point with nature. It was a learning laboratory for my kids. It was a source for me. I love gardens, so there was always greens for the holidays, gather and berries out there. And you began, I began to really fall in love with it. So of course, what happens over time is that, you know, as you know, all things change. You have to start looking and saying, we're paying so much taxes on this land, and kids are getting older and college is moving. We probably should look at divesting this parcel of land. But, you know, the options were the truth. You imagine that. It was a question of should we develop, and maybe like many of you, we were solicited over the years, maybe every 2 or 3 years. So it's always saying, hey, drive by your property. People would do this and drive letters to the mailbox, and people would be scanning, I guess, land registries and saying, oh, this is a parcel. Let's send it out. Real estate firms were interested in your land. Neighbors approached us. So again, the option was already floating in front of us, the opportunity to do some private development. And at the same time, I understood what I would be giving up. Because not only would it be this place that I love, but over the years, we also got to know all the animals who come through. So we're in a wildlife corridor. They call it a major wildlife corridor. And what that means, you haven't seen it, but 2 years ago, our bay bear came out of hibernation and destroyed everyone's suet feeders and bird feeders. Right? You haven't seen it, our bear came out. He's the size of that table in the background. He's the size of a Volkswagen bug. He's huge. And all the neighbors call each other and feed each other. Like the bear's out, the winter seeds, the winter feeders. You know? So we have that. Bobcats are in our area. We have moose and the owls are there. We see the snowy owls. So in a sense, at the same time you're saying, let's just sell the land. You know, I also recognize that, oh, we're taking away a lot of other things that are painful. So the option came up for us to, instead of giving up that land, we began looking at some other options. And a neighbor of mine was in the area much longer than I was. Had mentioned to me that he was actually working with North County Land Trust, and said that just might be a viable option for you. So I think I reached out at the time. It was Jim Morrison was in Jassy's role of predecessor, and there, you know, everybody there was wonderful to work with. And Jim happened to be the person who was my point person into their organization. And they were wonderful in terms of first being very upfront and honest and saying, you know, here's our focus. We're looking at environmentally sensitive land. We need to sort of take a look at your parcel. And when they did, they recognized it was a piece that they would love to see in conservation. It had adequate frontage to be developed. It was 7 acres, and behind that, there's large parcels of land that are landlocked now, but definitely could have been open for development. Probably 10 houses. You kind of put all those pieces together. There was fragile watershed next to it. You still could create access to it, so that wouldn't have stopped development. And also, it's precious aquifer, right? So it's feeding into the water supply system. And I also know that it was home to the bear and my friends, right? So I also had a vested interest in not seeing that necessarily develop on a large scale. The other thing that kind of pulled me towards really considering and just considering open the dialogue about conservation was that I have, maybe like many of you, very unique, I think it's like, you know, God's place on earth, because it's like big sky country, right? There's no light pollution, there's no noise pollution. I see stars at night. I can see them glowing down in the south, you know, we're in this big old Worcester, you know, at Holden, but my area is beautifully quiet, you know, and again, I get guard owls at nighttime. There's no leaf blow on Sunday, doesn't happen. Right? No, it just doesn't happen. And my road happens to be a rural end. It's a buddy, kind of like it's really not just a buddy Hudson. So part of it is dirt. There's a lot of open space on that road. So, you know, on a Sunday, we may see 3 cars, which is delightful. There isn't traffic, and there's a lot of people who are walking, neighbors are walking. So I also kind of understood that, you know, if I decided to go private development, my life experience is going to change fundamentally, as will my neighbors, you know. So I actively kind of engaged with NCOT. And again, I knew nothing about the programs I described, and I still don't. That's not my business. But the options were really positive as they put together programs might work for me. Certainly was going to obviate the $4,000 in taxes I paid every year on land I never intended to use and couldn't get out of it some way. I was not eligible for a 61 program. And instead, what happened is that my upfront expense was to pay for the survey of the land, which I would have to do anyway if I was going to pursue private development. So that was fine for me to kick that in. But all of the legwork, the heavy lifting, was done by me. They went off and touch base with John's organization, the Fitchburg water supply. Unbeknownst to me, but they pulled together the stakeholders in partnership. They just kept me informed along the way about who they were talking with and where they could bring this together, that this was the best program. It happened to be one where I got money up front, and then was allowed to claim a tax credit for about 5 or 6 years. So it wasn't as much as getting a big windfall where I had to pay all my taxes anyway on it, but instead it gave me some money to put towards my kids' college, which was a win-win I felt. I had some tax relief for about 5 years, which was great. And then at the same time, it allowed me to enjoy and continue to enjoy my life experience living on my property, surrounded by now totally conserved plants around us, which is great. The real benefit to me, the why it was the right choice, and I can look back on that now and say it is, financially, everything worked out. My kids got merit scholarships, yay. Hudson grants, double yay. One son became a RA at college to cut down the costs. So he was a resident assistant, yay, no room and board. And the other one was a groundskeeper at Roger Williams, yay again. So at the end of it, college was not this big thing. Pieces came together, so we didn't have that big expense. And they came away with very little debt, which is great. But for me, doing this, donating my land, it really became a statement to my family about, legacy. My kids are very proud that we donated that land. Hugely proud. And my family is in awe. It's like, why did you do that? So it's a little bit because they don't come from a background like that. And people in my community have reached out to me many times over the years to say, thank you so much. You took a walk on your property, or thank you so much. You had a beautiful hike, or we were part of the owl walk on the Zim's conservation area, is the name of it. So it also became something that my community appreciated. So it was contributing to my community. It was helping with the legacy feeling within my family. My sons are immensely proud, and we can still enjoy it. All of us. It's helping everybody. And financially, it all came out really good. Taxes are going to be all. It's not developed anywhere. We have the parking lot, and financially, that little bit of value that I got, the feed program, helped us cut down the college expenses. That was my intention. So overall, it was an excellent experience. It was a win-win. Excellent programs. They did all of everything, and it was a great outcome for me. Does anybody have any questions about what was going on with my experience or anything? I'm going to be here, so if you want to approach me afterwards, talk a little bit more one-on-one, I'll be happy to, okay? Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Leigh. Thank you. We were going to have another landowner come in, Joanne from Templeton, who sold a conservation restriction on her property, but she called me last night and was unable to make it today. So I'd like to introduce now Deline from the city of Fitchburg, the water division, and a large part of Westminster falls within the Watershed area for the city of Fitchburg's reservoir. And John will explain why it is one of the things that we look at, the land trust looks at when we're talking about conservation, whether a land has conservation value, does it protect drinking water supply? The importance of that for the city. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. As Jassy said, I'm in charge of the water department in Fitchburg. Before I get into that, I'd like to advocate for the Chapter 61 program. If anybody has, particularly more than 10 acres of forest land and they want to reduce their taxes, and they plan on not developing it for at least 5 years, you really should consider it. Because I have some land in Winchendon that's 58 acres, has enough, frontage for 4 lots. It's beautiful land. It has 8 acre field and, you know, very dry land. It's like it's all wetlands, but my taxes are only about $150 a year on chapter 61. So that goes to show you, you know, a reduction of several $1,000 is $150. Of course, my water bill, which is not my plan, you know, I have to go back 5 years, but, you know, I said, if you're going to do it for more than 5 years, plan to stay here and reduce your taxes. And that usually just involves just having a forester come in and, you know, do a plan for you, and it's not an expensive thing, usually $1,000, maybe something like that. That's my favorite, $800, and they kind of do a plan. Doesn't mean you have to harvest a bunch of timber, they can figure that out too. Maybe some beneficial cuts you can make some on, but there's no, you know, there's no definite thing that's going to be all cut off too. So I might have to do some improvement cuts and also realize that they come from that. So, but it's actually on I'm in charge of the water department in Fitchburg. We own or control or conservation restrictions on about 5,000 acres of land. You know, this started, you know, turn of the 19th century, you know, basically for all the mills in Fitchburg. So I know we took some water from Westminster, not as well as contention, but you know, the benefits are nowadays we have all kinds of open space preserved. Just think of it, that was all developed, all those lakes and watersheds. You know, we wouldn't have that water supply available. So, which I think is a huge benefit, not just for Westminster, but for Fitchburg. So, you know, with developing the watershed, no matter what it is, whether it's a single family house or multi, you know, single house, it does add, you know, more runoff and things like that. But perhaps the thing we're most concerned about is contaminants that get into the drink water supply reservoir. So, you know, I'm sure some of you have heard about PFAS and things like that. And also, you know, so we probably aware of all of the icing in the roadways. We're actually seeing an increase in, you know, chloride levels in the reservoirs, which at some point will have to be treated. May not be next year or the year after, but I envision in the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to have to add some type of treatment to the plants to compensate for it, because they are increasing, you know, slowly every year, you know, due to all the icing materials that we use. Of course, anytime you add any additional treatment, that costs a lot of money. Some of the communities are dealing with PFAS compounds in their drinking water supplies, whether they're groundwater, surface water, are spending millions of dollars on additional treatment, not just for the treatment system themselves, and maintenance and materials and things like that. So it can be a very expensive proposition. We have, much to my surprise, a few years ago, we did initial testing for PFAS compounds in our reservoirs and our plants, and there wasn't anything. We did some testing last year, and Meeting House Reservoir does have PFAS in it. The limits are 20 parts per trillion. We're seeing about 2 to 3 parts per trillion, so we don't have to treat for it, but it's something we have to be very vigilant about, to figure out, you know, make sure it's not going up any higher. Hopefully, there's been enough work with eliminating the type of chemicals, you know, firefighting foams and things like that, you know, contribute to this contamination. That, you know, those will no longer use, and we won't see those levels increase. That's something we got to keep an eye on. I'm not super concerned about this point, but I am concerned that we need to keep an eye on it and make sure it doesn't come off. So, with developing the watershed beyond runoff and things like that, the other thing you have to be worried about is septic systems. Now, you know, septic systems do treat for some things, you know, particularly to get rid of, you know, nitrates and things like that. But if there's any, you know, somebody pours paint thinner in there, you know, cleans things in their sink, that's going to end up in the water table and eventually make its way to the reservoir or your well. So the septic systems do not treat for any type of contaminants like that. It just doesn't work. Those leaching facilities, they just, you know, they filter out some things that, you know, help protect to some extent. So if you have a lot of additional development in the watersheds with a bunch of septic systems, I mean, that's going to contribute eventually, you know, unless people are very careful with what they do with their houses. You know, some contaminants getting into the groundwater. So again, that will add to, you know, we get to a certain level, we're going to have to treat for those. So, we've worked with all kinds of programs protecting land, you know, drinking water supply grants, forest legacy, some of the other land grants that the state has. We just, you know, preserve the farm, the Golden Watershed area, Jewel Hill Farm, the Crocker Farm up there, 700 acres, beautiful property that we actually worked with the trustees of Reservation Farm. You know, they actually own right now, but between a land grant, drinking water supply protection, their monies, we were able to work together, something that was a very expensive proposition by somebody on their own. We were able to all work together. So just, you know, if you have any consideration about protecting land, you reach out to the local land trust, and they'll, you know, help to figure it out, or even contact us. It's in our watershed, and they'll help, you know, no cost to you, see if it's something that we can help you protect. So,
Joanne, while you're out there, could you point out on the map over there the water bodies in Westminster? that
Sure.
contribute
Yep.
To the water supply?
yeah, absolutely. So we have Meeting House Reservoir. That's the terminal reservoir to the regional treatment plant. Basically, the water from there goes to the treatment plant. We also have Mare Meadow Reservoir, which is our largest water body, our best water supply, as well as Fitchburg Reservoir, which is over on the Hudson, Princeton area, basically divided there. So we pump. Meeting House really doesn't have enough of a safe yield. We have to pump from Mare Meadow pretty much all summer long. Otherwise, the reservoir basically drain down. There isn't enough water in there, basically, you know, from runoff and things like that, particularly during the drier months, to supply both Fitchburg and Westminster. So we have a pump station pump from Mare Meadow. We have Bickford that we pump from there over into Mare Meadow when Mare Meadow starts to get down. The Mare Meadow Reservoir and Bickford Pond Reservoir are in the Ware River watershed. You know, basically all this flows to the south. And we have Water Management Act permits for all of this, that the state regulates how much water we take out. We usually want so much going down out of Mare Meadow and Bickford as they have water to the Ware River. So we have to be, you know, aware of that, how much pumping we do. So we haven't tested Bickford and Mare Meadow for PFAS yet, but we plan on doing that this year. Like I said, we haven't seen it up here until this past year, 2021. So now I just want to see what the other levels are there too. So again, Mare Meadow is our largest reservoir. And it really is a pristine reservoir. I mean, we've been told by the state that it's actually cleaner than Coavan or Wachusett. Terrific fishing there, I guess. I haven't gone fishing, but I understand that when they've done some basically bass fishing game, fishing wildlife, will go out and do some shocking of the water, whatever, see what type of fish species and sizes are in there. They said it's unbelievable what's in there. So if you are fishing, you can fish for there. So from Westminster, so that's a pretty neat thing to see. Unfortunately, we do have South Street that has a roadway going through there. I wish that wasn't there, because of course with the icing, you need to keep everybody, you know, safe on the roadways, but that's also contributing to, you know, increasing chloride levels every year in the water. So our treatment plant is over in Hagen Park. We can supply. We have two treatment plants. One over on Ridley Road in Fitchburg that basically has the northern watershed going to it. And then we have the one in Hagen Park that the southern watershed goes to. So we can supply the whole city of Fitchburg as well as Westminster out of this plant, but we can't do it from the other plant unless supplies part of Fitchburg to it. But we can shut down the other plant and run, you know, supply everybody out of this. So this plant is now about 20 years old. At some point, it's going to have some work done to it. We've been, you know, keeping up to date. We spend, you know, several $100,000 every year on maintenance and things like that. But we are looking at possibly some changes in treatment, you know, probably in the next 5 to 10 years. You know, when we do rehab it, all the filters and clarifiers. And if anybody ever wanted to order any of these, I'd be happy to just reach out to me. I'd love to bring it through there. So, you know, we keep it up pretty well, as you would expect for drinking water supply. So, some interesting facts about the water supply, about the usage. Fitchburg uses less water than it ever has. We're actually down like 20% in the last 10 years. When the mills are running, you know, in the 70s, the city would use 20, 30 million gallons a day on average, you know, over the year. Now we're down to 4 or 5 million gallons, say about 4.5 million gallons a day, which is taking partially from the northern watershed and the southern watershed. Westminster has gone up in usage, you know, versus Fitchburg, you know, just because of the development. You know, we see development in Fitchburg, but it's, you know, it's not really offsetting the reduction, you know, with the older housing stock, the improvements that are done to that as far as low flow, you know, shower heads and people being more, conserving more and things like that. So I think that's all I can think of right now. But like I said, it's so important to protect, prevent roads from being built in the watersheds, prevent additional houses. I know it's nice living out there, but we really don't want to see too many more because of just how it can impact the watershed, particularly large housing developments. All that additional runoff and de-icing of those roadways, people washing their cars, fertilizing the lawns, all those things add up, to some type of loading to the watershed and then eventually to the residents themselves. Basically, will find their way down into there.
So folks, if your house has municipal water as opposed to an on-site well, you're getting your water from Fitchburg. So when we help the city of Fitchburg protect land here in Westminster, we're actually helping to protect our own public drinking water supply.
100% of the public water supply in Westminster comes from the watershed there. So Steve pointed out, it's very important to protect it. Because once it's developed, we'll never go back. Just won't, And I think, out west we see it, but our water supplies are very important. We had one year last year, but there's other years where it's very dry and we want to make sure we have plenty of water for everybody all around, honestly, for water and lawn, things like that, just sort of, human consumption. I want to make sure that there's adequate supplies to that. And there has been droughts where, these reservoirs are drained way down. We haven't seen anything of major, couple decades. A few years ago, we had a pretty good drought. Mare Meadow, I don't know if anybody went by, so I was down quite a bit. We actually had to use Bickford as well. We haven't had to use Bickford too much in the last few years, just because it's been plenty out of Mare Meadow. And of course, it costs a lot to pump water. So that's an expense, and I'm trying to keep the expenses low, not just for the city of Fitchburg, but also keep them lower for Westminster. So, but at the same time, we need to do the right thing, make sure that people have the best water quality possible. And I will do a little, we do have to add chemicals at the treatment plant for treatment, but we do our best. I just want to make a plug for that to keep it as low as possible. I'm a advocate that, we do have to disinfect the water, but we keep it as low a chlorine level as possible because we can create byproducts like carcinogens. We actually add less chlorine now than we ever have. It keeps, we keep around 1.4, 1.5 parts per million. You can go up to 4 parts per million, never keep it close to that, around 1.4, 1.5, just enough to give a residual disinfectant out the far ways of the distribution system. But I just wanted to add that. So that's why it's like, I really don't want to see anything with PFAS or even chlorides, because I know more than likely we're going to have some other chemicals to treat those things, the use of processes there. And the less that we add to the water, the better everybody is health-wise. You don't want just the contaminants to move. You don't want to add any more chlorine. You don't want to add any more of the, the other things we add, to make sure that everything's filtered out. So it's very important that we try to protect these watersheds as much as possible.
I have a question.
Sure.
In Westminster, how much of the watershed is protected and how much would you like to see?
Yeah, I'd like to be 100% protected. I say 30, 40%, 40%. I think we're probably at 50%. So having said that, a lot of that land can't be developed. So, because of different other environmental regulations, Wetlands Protection Act, Rivers Protection Act, the Watershed Protection Act, is Mare Meadow and Bickford fall into that Watershed Protection Act. So a lot of them can't be developed, but I'd love to be able to make sure that that we can protect more, particularly on the parcels that do have a stream or a wetlands or something like that. I'd like to keep it developed as far away from those type of resource areas as possible. So yeah.
If you have a piece of land that was in a stream area or something that you put into a conservation restriction, and then you wanted to donate it, but get funds from that donation, does the value of that land go up as far as
If you already have a conservation restriction on that, it probably won't be as much, because it's been reduced by that amount, so, but we still look at, we have to do an appraisal, where, you know, where we use state approved appraisers for everything, like, you know, hire somebody to get low or something like that, you know, we do that, you know, on its own thing, you know. Yeah, we have more likely to try our conservation restriction. And sites out there is going to be not quite as much value we've got for the conservation restriction.
I just want to comment to that. A lot of people, my landlord is working conservation primarily as an attorney. I talked to him a little bit of tax stuff before this, and he said with most people, they will do the conservation restriction the year before or late, like November, December, and then do the land second, because then you'll get even more reduction in tax wise. But those people will do it in construction, but 1 year to the next.
Yeah, every situation's a little different, and we're, you know, what kind of interest they know, figure that out. So again, we're not going to reach out to us about our parcel yet. One year there, we don't have a lot. We sold the conservation restriction ourselves. We sold the conservation restriction on our other watershed, about 1,800 acres, which is now much more than 1,800 acres. Some bass fishing game to over that land, hunting and fishing. So we haven't done that. We're hoping to do the same thing with the south watershed. The south watershed, we haven't done that yet. Obviously, a lot of money, but we'd love to be able to do that. That's kind of why we don't allow hunting and fishing. We're hoping to leverage that someday. And when we did get that amount from the northern watershed, some of it went to the city, but the majority of the stayed with the water division. It has been a dedicated fund for land protection. We don't use it for anything else. So we didn't take that money and put in new water mains or anything like that. The money that we got from our conservation restriction on this northern watershed went to that. And with that money, we've been able to leverage millions of dollars in federal and state funds for land. I mean, when I mean millions, I mean millions. Funds from the federal and state government. So we did the, I started before I was back in Fitchburg, the Farmland to the Washington Forest Legacy Grant, which hundreds of acres of property we were protecting. We actually didn't use all the money for that grant going back. But it really did a lot for protection of the watershed areas. So, and the other thing I want to add, you know, now that I brought the quad to Westminster, it's like we have a huge area that's undeveloped. I mean, just a large, I mean, yeah, there's some houses and roadways, but there's a lot of woodland in there. And as far as, you know, species like eagles, loons on Bickford, probably most of the other water bodies now too, but Bickford was the first. We're proud that, you know, we're able to be part of those type of things too. You know, not just for the drinking water supply part, but also for the wildlife, flora, fauna, you know, that we're protecting these large contiguous pieces of property with very limited development. Because as the state gets developed, we're going to lose more and more of these. And there's some core areas where we do have a lot of woodland, you know, that's contiguous. And this is one of the ones that's a priority for the state. So, Northern Watershed, not quite so much, but, you know, the Wachusett area and our lands that we control are just, it's just a large area, you know, for all things like that. So, and I know, one of the first ponds in our area, lakes in our area, was Bickford. We've been a partner with Mass Fish and Game to try to protect the nesting there. Unfortunately, sometimes people like too close to those nests, and if it's disturbed in the last couple of years, we haven't had as much nesting. We also have some activity up in the northern watershed, and again, we try to, you know, block off trails, things that people go in there. So we're not just protecting the water supply; we're trying to, you know, help with the species like that. You know, make sure that, you know, there are, you know, the land that we protected is also a home to them, and they're protected there too, so that, you know, they have the benefit of it as well. So, yeah.
I hear what you said you were working to try to open up the land around the and
At some point, you know, we're trying to leverage some money from the state to buy a conservation restriction on it, open it. So that might be, we haven't had much talks lately, but it's the next one. But again, that would be to purchase more lands for, you know. Now, as far as the water bodies themselves, would be shore fishing, but there wouldn't be any boat fishing, we would all want to. There wouldn't be any ice fishing, there wouldn't be snowmobiles, there wouldn't be ATVs, there wouldn't be any duck hunting on it. You know, we protect, there would be a buffer zone around each of those. As we did with the northern watershed, you know, shore fishing like Mare Meadow would be fine, but I don't want anybody to think that because we sell the conservation restriction to the state, to open up the hunting fishing, and all of a sudden, you know, there's a boats going in everywhere and people are doing whatever, but there'll still be quite a few restrictions on that. So
right now, people
not right now. Yeah, no, we don't. We only have one person, so over 5,000 acres, we don't get too much unless it becomes a problem. You know, if we go out and find somebody that's, you know, duck hunting on big herd or something, then we would do something about that. So but we know what goes on, but it's kind of one of those gray areas. So depends on whether it's abused or not. So again, our first requirement is to make sure that, you know, the watersheds are protected. So anything else? Any other questions or? Yeah, like I said, if anybody has any questions for me, I don't have any cards. I'm going to bring some extras along, but you know, right on the website for the city of Fitchburg, whether it's a question about the water supply, your drinking water, any land that you might want to protect, question about if there's any activities that you think should be going on in some property someplace, even if it's a private landowner, they, you know, start collecting cars in a sensitive area or something like that. You know, we're happy to help investigate that. You know, try to make sure that we you know, prevent those things from happening. So I would ask if you live in the watershed, try not to use too much lawn fertilizer. Try not to wash your car too much. Be sensitive about when you put down your drains and things like that, because it, you know, more likely if you're out there, you probably have a well there too. So it's important for us, but it's important for people as well. You know, it's like a lot of people I have that's on everything's going to get treated in there. It doesn't. Those chemicals do not. They just go right into the ground. Somebody rinses out their paintbrush or paint thinner, you know, just a couple stuff throw down the drain. You know, I don't want to bring it, you know, to have this waste there and look at. That ends up in the water supply. That septic system is not going, that leach field is not going to treat it. It's going to probably reduce it a bit, but it's still going to be into your groundwater. And that's something you don't want. So.
And one other thing, as John was saying, is that I think, you know, for us as landowners, I think with the conservation restriction, as Jassy was saying, you can almost define what the use of your land will be because you still own it. And it won't be developed. So, you know, you can choose to agriculture, farm it, or, you know, not develop it, but choose to use your land the way you do. And it's not a public resource. For those of us who have participated in a feed program and relinquished out to our land, the accepting agencies will decide what the best use of that is. So in my case, as an example, you know, the passive recreation that John described, you can walk on it, it's listed as viable hiking trail, there are organized educational tours. For me, that was a great benefit because, you know, to put land simply in a protected status but not allow people to enjoy it, it kind of almost undermines what we're trying to do. We want people to appreciate the land and use it in a responsible way, but make sure that it's there for generations and that it is sensitive to the environment, or we're being sensitive to the environment that's around it. So it's not being overused and ATVs ripping it up and such, that we're good, you know, stewards of the land. And that's what the programs can do as well. So, you know, whether I know in our area, it's nice. My son always used to go and fish at Marion. It was a nice evening thing to go out and fish bass, right? So it's a positive thing. But again, you know, what is responsible use for humans of the land versus overuse? And I think that in my experience has been very positive. That again, passive recreation has been positive. We do have hunters in our area in Princeton, big deer hunters. They've been hunting there for 30 years. It's not overhunted. They're very respectful. And I always think that's a very nice symbiotic relationship too, because they do have a great appreciation for nature. So I guess that's what happened as a landowner.
We find that people, so people that hike or hunters, whatever, there's excellent stewards of the property too. They notify us of something that they think isn't right or whatever. with that, if you do have a conservation restriction on the property, then you would come out and do it. If Fitchburg holds it, I'm sorry who holds it, but we would come out and inspect the property usually on an annual basis, to walk over. And as part of the process of doing a conservation restriction, is a baseline documentation report that's put together, basically documents the condition of the property. If there's some old farm equipment that's left in, they'll take pictures of that. They want to see that attitude. I would want to see it removed grass, I don't know what it is, but they will do that. It ends up being 100, 200 pages of baseline documentation report with all the pictures and things like that. That's a picture of the forest, the condition, document those type of things. But then we would take that baseline documentation report, and once a year we go out to the property. That one reservoir caretaker we have would go out and inspect the property, make sure that it wasn't some treatment that wasn't supposed to take place, or some rubbish is dumped someplace, or some other activity just isn't allowed by the conservation restriction. We would have to do some type of enforcement letter to say, hopefully, any issues with that. Sometimes it's the partner that actually does something else, they'll put something over the property line, something like that. We have to make sure that doesn't happen. Our big problem just needs to use stuff. Some properties that we have to make sure that there's a conservation restriction on that. That's not going to be allowed as farm using for septic tractors, activities. But if it's a trail that that's causing issues, we will probably send letters that we need to block this off, or we'll issue block. I think that's all we have. Any other questions at all? Like I said, my notes on the website. Anything afterwards, please feel free to give me a call. Whether it's the drinking water, if you want to tour the plants, you want to know what's in the water, you want to see what's going on there, or we're completely open to all that. If you want to protect your land, great. Another plug for the Chapter 61 program, like I said, if taxes are referred to you, you have enough acreage, you can afford to come in and do that. Before you plan to file the state, get into that. Save quite a bit. So. All right. Thank you. Appreciate everybody coming today.
So we've talked about an awful lot. We talked a little bit about what conservation is and the tools that you could use to conserve your land. Both me and John have touched upon different ways that land can be conserved and different values that we look at, whether it's wildlife habitat, whether it's drinking water supply, and the fact that conservation restrictions can be tailored a little bit to the individual landowner, but also to the organization that might be holding that conservation. So now what's important to many of you is to, okay, how does all of this relate to estate planning, and how are you going to work with some of these tools, perhaps, when figuring out what to do with your estate? So I would like to introduce now Erin Leigh. Erin is an attorney who specializes in estate planning, and she'll explain to you some of the important things that you need to consider when you are doing estate planning, and how.
Just stand by that. I love this. I didn't have any slides because I wasn't sure how much detail you guys would want and where to lead the discussion, but I'll give you a brief overview. The estate plan relates to the topic here today for your land use planning, because you need to make sure that your wishes are fulfilled. What if you've engaged with one of these organizations to start putting your land into conservation or into chapter, and then you become incapacitated? That's when you will have wanted to have a durable power of attorney drafted, so your agent can make sure that's fulfilled during your lifetime. Or if you pass away while you're, I'm sorry to be the down person here, but if you pass away while you're going through that, you want to make sure that that's carried forward. If you have a will, you've appointed somebody in charge of your estate that knows those wishes, or if you have a trust with a trustee that can carry that forward. So that's the worst case scenario here. But in general, your estate plan consists of your lifetime planning in case of incapacity. then also making sure that, if you want to make sure land is preserved, but you haven't put it into one of these chapters or into a conservation restriction, and maybe you want your heirs to do so, you can put that in your estate plan. It's often better to do that during your lifetime, but sometimes people aren't really sure what their children want to do, and maybe they want to make sure some of the land is put into chapters, so put that into their plan. So the main components of an estate plan would be, everybody knows about a will. That will come into play after you've passed away, and that will direct where all of your property that goes through your will pass. But you have to be mindful that if you have IRAs or life insurance or jointly held property, none of that goes through the will. So when you're trying to think about where your property goes, make sure you understand where your beneficiary, designated property is going, and if you have jointly owned property, that won't go through the wishes of your will. Same with the trust. Some people will do trust planning. It's the same deal. Only the property that's in the trust is ruled by the terms of the trust. So anything the beneficiary or joint owner wouldn't necessarily be in there. The lifetime planning would be the power of attorney, as I mentioned before. The power of attorney is critical because if something happened to you during your lifetime and you don't have a power of attorney, and somebody needs to make sure your expenses were paid, they need to get into your bank account, withdraw from your retirement, you're going to have a conservator appointed by the court if you don't have this document. And that's just not, you're basically giving your money to the court and the attorneys to go through that process, which is better to have a document in place ahead of time where you designate somebody to be in charge of your affairs if you're incapacitated. With that power of attorney, you can also direct that, maybe you've started with a conservation restriction or you're thinking of donating land. Maybe you just make monetary donations every year to a land use organization like one of these. And if you wish for your agent to continue that when you're incapacitated, you have to have those wishes in that document. Otherwise, your agent cannot do those gifts. They can only make sure you're taken care of, which is the priority, obviously. You just want to make sure you're taken care of. So often when people think of estate planning, they're thinking about tax savings or Medicaid planning. And we forget that the most important thing is making sure that you yourself are taken care of if you become incapacitated. That's why I advocate for that power of attorney as the priority document, as well as the healthcare power of attorney. Those you can often find a free form for that online or at a doctor's office or the hospital. But if you have particular wishes, you'll want to have a professional help you draft that. That document is when you appoint an agent to make your healthcare decisions. So that's pretty critical. You want to pick somebody who has your interests in mind. If you don't have somebody designated, there could, be an issue where a guardian has to be appointed by a court, which is not what anybody wants to have to go through. You look like you might have had a question. No, but you might stop. But as I go through, the estate plan, if you have any questions that you want to try to interject, just let me know, because I want this to be responsive to what your questions might be. So the lifetime things are your power of attorney, your healthcare power of attorney, most important. To make sure that your legacy and your wishes are followed through, that would be your will and your trust if you do incorporate a trust into your plan. The other important thing, I think I do have people here who might have minor children. A will is critical because that's the document you use to name a guardian for your child in case you and the other parent is no longer here. There's also an emergency guardianship proxy document that you can have drafted, which would appoint somebody to temporarily take care of your children or adult disabled, children as well. Because otherwise the court will have to step in and appoint somebody, if you're alive, but your will hasn't come into play. So the trust is also important for, parents of minor children or adult disabled children, because if you would prefer that your children not inherit everything at age 18, they may not be that responsible, you'll want to have a trust in place to direct the management of that inheritance for the minors. And also when they are minors, to make sure there's somebody who's in charge of the funds that is, you're leaving for them to make sure their care is provided for. So that's the basic broad overview of estate planning. A lot of people will come in and ask, how can I save my house from Medicaid or from estate taxes? That gets a little complicated. There are many different things you can do. It is very dependent on your assets, where your assets are held, how they're held, and the amount of assets you have, as well as your wishes. But But in general, as far as estate taxes are concerned, state taxes only come into play in Massachusetts if you have more than $1 million in your estate and you pass away. If you have $1,001, you get to file, or your heirs get to file an estate tax return, and then they're levied, on all of the funds in the estate after the first $60,000 at a graduated rate. It is fairly low. It maxes out at a rate of 16% when you're at $10 million or more. For most people between, 1 to 3 million, it might average around 9%, overall. So that's fine. On the federal side, there is also an estate tax at that level. It is ridiculously high, at least for me, in my opinion, because it's at 12 million is the threshold on the federal level. You're only taxed on the federal level on the amounts above the threshold amount. But unfortunately, that's going to be reduced down to around 6 million in 2026. So some of you may have to worry about that. Good for you. So that's kind of the gist of the estate taxes. It's often better to leave property in your estate and have an estate tax levied against it than to plan otherwise. Because there's another tax that comes into play, which is the capital gains tax. Now, I'm not an accountant and I'm not a financial advisor, but these are definitely things you want to be thinking about when you're doing your estate planning. Capital gains, the tax rate is around 15 to 20% at the federal level. And then the Commonwealth assesses, I think it's at 7% right now, on top of, so you're paying, a large amount. That's more than that 16% max amount, or 9% that most people pay in estate tax. So I bring that up because some people will come to me and say, I want to put my house in an irrevocable trust, meaning put it into a trust that I can't change, and I can't control, so then Medicaid can't put a lien against the house. Or maybe they want to put the house into that type of trust that's not part of their estate for estate taxes. The problem is if you do that and your children or your heirs inherit this property, they're now having a basis of what you paid for the property instead of the date of death value. So that would be a capital gains tax on the growth of that, the value of that asset instead of just date of death value. Maybe they sell it in a year and they don't have much of a gain. For Medicaid, it does make sense sometimes to put your house into a irrevocable trust, but it can cost a lot of money to set that up. You also need to be careful because Medicaid, they have regulations, they have very strict regulations about how that trust is worded. You can't have control over that house, you can't have control over the assets. So you have to be very careful on how that's drafted because it may end up counting as an available asset when you apply for Medicaid, even though you've done that work. So it's a little tricky. Medicaid is a very expansive, complicated subject. I can give you a little bit of information on that as well if you're interested, but it's one big factor to consider when you think about estate tax planning.
Yeah. For back up a little bit and talk to us about what a trust is and like, how they why or how.
Yeah, a trust is very helpful because you can, if you have a will, you may not want to put all of your wishes and everything in your will. You may have, like, if you have a woman who wanted to have some land conserved, but she wasn't sure if her children want to do that. They were not well off, so she didn't want to have them in. So instead of putting in her will a wish that she would prefer things to be put in conservation, which would have made it very messy at the probate court, we drafted a trust for her. And we put in the wish that the children consider putting land in conservation. And this, we had a family meeting as well. And unfortunately, after she passed, people weren't quite getting along. But the fact that we had talked about conservation really helped. And we had that wish in the trust. It wasn't required in this instance, but having it in there and having it not have to go through probate court because we had the land going through her trust really helped mediate the dispute between the heirs because they knew, okay, mom and dad had this land, they used to have a goat farm on this land. And I remember as a kid, feeding the goats and going hiking and all of these things. And it was kind of a common goal that they could come together on of maybe we will go ahead and put this into conservation. So instead of having this property going through the will where we would have had to go to probate court and they would have had to approve, putting the land in conservation or selling it, we just had it going through the trust with the wishes and intent of the trustee in there. But for some people, they want to make sure the land is put into conservation or donated in some manner after they pass away. And that's when the trust would be critical in that sense. You would put that. So a trust is nice because you don't have to go through the probate court if you put your property into the trust, and you can amend your trust during your lifetime. Not the one I talked about before with the Medicaid, the estate tax savings, that irrevocable trust you can't amend, but a living trust, a revocable living trust. You can put your property into that during your lifetime and change it as you go through life with what your wishes are. And then you don't have to go through the probate process, particularly with land or houses, when you've put the deed into the name of the trust. If you've just left everything in your own individual name, you have to go through probate, which is not as bad as it used to be, but it's just another thing you have to do. You have to give notice to all of the heirs at law, which are all of the people who would have inherited if you wouldn't have had the will, and you have to give notice to all the people you named in your will. So if you put in your will, Johnny gets my silver set, Johnny has to get notice of everything that's going on, as well as, you know, the house or land is going to be sold. He gets notice of that. When you close the estate and where all the funds are going, he has to get notice of that. Most people don't want to have to go through, you know, keeping everybody apprised of all those details. So a trust is, you know, preferred in that case. And it's important to, you know, if you don't have your land in a trust or jointly held, just be cognizant that if you pass away without a will, the court has to approve any sale or transfer. So if there's any dispute amongst the people who would inherit from you, if you didn't have a will, you really should think about getting that in place so you can alleviate those court costs and the dispute. That's critical. The trust is also nice, like I mentioned, for beneficiaries who maybe need some help and maybe shouldn't get all of their funds all at once. You want to make sure they have money throughout their lifetime. You would have a trustee who would manage their share with directions from you on how that funds should be spent. And for couples, for married couples, there's estate tax savings with the trust that you can incorporate provisions for. So Massachusetts, this is just going to be another complicated thing you're going to love. In Massachusetts, we have $1 million threshold for the estate tax. If you're leaving everything to your spouse, no estate tax is due at that time because of the marital deduction. When the second spouse dies, however, everything they have is now going to be taxed. Maybe they've spent it down under the $1 million in their lifetime, which is, you know, what you kind of hope that you can enjoy it. But the preferred method, if you already have a trust in place, is to give that spouse who survived the option to put some of the inheritance into a sub-trust called a credit shelter or bypass trust. And what that entails is you file an estate tax return when the first spouse dies, and you say, look, I'm going to take less than $1 million and put it on this return for the first spouse. And then you keep it separated, have it if you need it. And then when the second spouse dies, those funds are not part of their estate. We already declared it in the estate of the first spouse. So you can do that with a trust. It's a little annoying to me that Massachusetts, you have the option on the federal level to not have to have a trust to take advantage of this. You can just check a box when the second spouse dies, stating, hey, I'm going to claim their exemption too. They don't do that in Massachusetts. You're kind of forced to have a trust, or you have to pay a tax person a lot of money to have that done after the first person dies. It's a complicated process without those terms of a trust. But maybe things will reform here. There has been some talk of increasing the exemption to 2 million. Maybe they'll put that check the box on there, but I don't know. So that's kind of the summary on that one there. And just so you know, you want to make sure that the deed that you have for your property, you know, if you haven't, you may have purchased it, maybe you're a couple and you purchased it before you were married. You may not realize that when you purchased it, it wasn't jointly held. Maybe it's held the two of you individually. You might want to review those just to see how they're titled, because if you purchase the property as two individuals, it's in common, and one person dies, 50% of that is going through their probate estate instead of directly to the other owner. So often, if somebody's got property as two individuals and they would like to hold it jointly so the survivor inherits, you would want to change the title to joint, you know, joint title with rights of survivorship, something of that nature. There's also another option called the life estate deed, which comes into play often with Medicaid planning. in which you would give somebody your property, but you retain the right to live there for the rest of your life, as well as any income that's earned. So maybe you have an accessory apartment you rent out, you can still retain that income. That's helpful for the Medicaid plan piece for capital gains, because that way, if the person that you've left it to inherits it when you die, they get the step up in basis. So you have a good tax situation there. Doesn't have to go through probate because they're the owner automatically when the person with the life estate dies. And for Medicaid, after 5 years, it's not going to count as a gift because there's a 5-year look back with Medicaid. You know, so if you needed Medicaid within 5 years of that title of the life estate deed of it being filed, there could be some issues, although sometimes there's some workarounds there. That just makes things a little cleaner. The issue would be if you put your property in a life estate deed, you just have to be cognizant that that person that you've given it to, while you've retained the right to live there, they have rights to that property. So if you want to mortgage the property, you need them to sign off. If you sell the property, they're entitled to a portion of the sales proceeds. They have a really crazy, complicated calculation to figure out that percentage. That's basically based on the life expectancy on Social Security tables for the person who has that life interest. So there's a lot of different things with estate plan that you can do. There's a lot of different ways you can set up trusts. There are millions of different kinds of trusts because really a trust is something that you create, usually with your attorney, to dictate how certain property that you put into the trust will be used or can be used. So there's a lot of flexibility with trust, which makes it a popular option, you know, because you're not having to go to the probate court for one. You can use it for maybe you have a beneficiary who has government needs-based benefits. You would want to have a trust set up for them to make sure that whatever they inherit doesn't offset, you know, the benefits that they may need to live on. And they may not have enough that they're inheriting to support them for the rest of their life. You can use a trust to, you know, hold just property. You know, maybe you have a vacation home or you have a large parcel that you like to hike on. You can put it separately in its own trust with its own terms and how you want it used. So it's a lot of flexibility with trust in that sense. It's kind of like you're setting up your own, well, it's a trust. You're setting up a contract with the world at large with how things shall be managed, you know, after you pass away and during your life, you have control over it. See if I had any other things I wanted to make sure I covered. Yeah, so the main thing with estate plan is just making sure that the wishes for your property will be followed through. And as far as land use planning, you just really have to be mindful of, you know, what is it that you want to do? Was it, you know, your heirs, what do you want to do with the land? It's always good to check in with them. You know, if you assume, well, I'm just going to leave them as large parcel, because I'm sure they're going to just keep it that way. That may not be the case. Then there's also the fact that you may have, or your heirs may have financial pressures, and they may be in a spot where they have to have some income or some assets have to be sold to support them. And as far as Medicaid is concerned, if you have a large parcel with a lot of value, you know, it puts a lot of pressure on you as a homeowner. Even if you just have a house with 2 acres, you know, if you're a single person and you may need long-term care, you're going to end up having to sell that house, or a lien will be placed on that property for the cost of your care from Medicaid. If you put something into a conservation restriction ahead of the time of needing that, you know, that could probably help you with your eligibility, you know, because it's restricted and therefore the value is reduced and it's not a parcel that you can easily sell in the open market. Now, I don't know exactly how Medicaid deals with conservation restrictions. I do know that it reduces the value. I haven't seen them take a position that, you know, a chapter land should be sold or anything like that, because I think that would be a very unpopular position. So I'm kind of giving you a very quick overview with a lot of information, and I just want to open it up to any questions that people may have or other things that they'd like more information on.
Well, I was just thinking, maybe you could just give us a couple of models of estate planning you've done that you think might be of interest.
Good example.
No,
Yeah. The one in particular, I had a client who had a sister who had special needs and was living with her father, and her father passed away. And he had a very messy estate plan, but he did have a trust.
So all the land was in trust. They had a very large parcel and a view shed that a lot of people enjoy going down this one area. And I was like, oh, I wonder if I could talk to them about considering putting that into conservation, because they could get, the value of the land and then keep it open and all the animals could enjoy it. And it turned out they were very amenable to that because they enjoyed, when they were kids, going through the property like your family. We did have a little wrinkle where we, as a trustee, and I should have brought this up, the father put the property in the trust and didn't have any particular directions about how it should be used. So when he passed away, it's up to the beneficiaries, the people he named, his 3 children, on how they want to manage the property. Do they want to donate land? Do they not? Well, unfortunately, one sibling was, oh, I would love to donate it or sell it to conservation. Another sibling was at the position of, we need to get the maximum amount of money out of this land. And then you have the child with a disability who you have to make sure you get them the maximum value of the land because you owe them an obligation. And that person needed a guardian to represent themselves. If this parent would have maybe had their estate plan reviewed and had a separate clause in there about it's okay to put the land into conservation, even if it doesn't yield you the maximum amount financially, that would have made things easier. Now, we've managed to work with a conservation attorney who did get it appraised. Like you had mentioned, when you put something in conservation, you get the appraisal of the maximum development and then the reduced value. And was able to work with the family to show them that they could get a little bit of, some tax benefit from this, and they're still going to get some money from it. And I think they did get that guardian set up for the other sibling. But if they would have done more pre-planning, it would have been a lot easier. We're still hoping to get this land into conservation. Unfortunately, the other thing that really drove me nuts after all the work that this other attorney did with this family was they got to the point where they convinced the other beneficiaries we can still get a lot of money selling to conservation. They worked with the town worked with them for like 3 to 4 years. And all of a sudden, a little 5-acre parcel in this town came up for sale and somebody wanted to put affordable housing on it. People freaked out, said, we need to buy that 5-acre parcel, convinced the select board to buy the 5-acre parcel, and all the work they've done to buy this 25-acre parcel went down the drain. So it puts a lot of pressure on us trustees. And we have a situation with the disabled beneficiary, the beneficiary who wants the maximum amount, and the beneficiary who wants to put it in conservation. The longer this sits there, the more pressure there is to sell it to a developer because they didn't have that in place.
Here's another personal situation, right? So this is my experience as well. My mother had a very nice piece of property in Canada, right on the river. And it happened in Simsbury. It was the only riverfront, publicly accessible kind of thing. It was a bridge by itself, so it's a very long piece of property. And so she had a trust sale. She had her home and property put on into her trust. But as she aged, and she asked me to become more involved with her, we looked at her trust and her will. Things were outdated, so we got a new lawyer too, like a lawyer. And so what she ended up doing was, at their recommendation, is that she put me as a joint trustee on her trust. And I have a sibling who's out on the West Coast, and he's not been involved at all. I mean, he's been away for about 40 years, lovely great brother, but it's very removed from my mother for day to day. I was the care advocate, not care, but advocate. So what happened was that this very wise, I think, lawyer put me as the co-trustee, so that as my mother, I was able to make decisions about the trust. Put it that way. So as my mother aged out of her home, she had wanted to die in place, take me out feet first, she said. But then she felt no longer safe in the house alone. So she wanted to, we explored an assisted living arrangement for her to go to. But it also meant that we needed to dispose of her home. And that's when the town had always been interested in her house because of its unique property. At the end of a cul-de-sac, it's next to the flower bridge. If you know the flower bridge in Simsbury, it's a walking bridge, it's gorgeous. Her property abutted that, and they were saying this would become a beautiful access, public access to the Farmland River. There was none for the town of 28,000 people. So what was nice was that my mother became her executive function failed. She really was no longer to make decisions. I found a beautiful place that she wanted to go to, fabulous place. I was able to act on the trust and work with the town to negotiate, which was again a donation of the property, working with inherited property, we got access to money that she needed to get into the assisted living. And they ended up, which they should, raise the house because it was old and put it into a public park. And all of that without involvement of my brother. It wasn't his choice. And I had the lawyers to back it up and everything. He didn't care. But it would have been hard if I had siblings, but I wouldn't need to because I was a joint trustee. And then when she did pass, the trust again identified everything else that she wanted. And it didn't go through probate, and I had the documents shared with my brother, and one other person decided to say this is mom's wishes, and here's the disposition of these assets that remain that were in the trust. We didn't go to court, it was clean and simple, and then the trust ended. And as soon as she passed, the trust no longer exists. And it's the trustee's responsibility just to dispose of the assets. So we were lucky to get the lawyer. We could see that dynamic unfolding a little bit. He was poking like, what's with this brother? I said, well, he's not going in the picture. But until the money becomes available, right? Yeah. That was a very exposure about a good experience.
Yeah.
Not that I had.
Yeah. No, and that's critical too, because as that agent, as a trustee, or as a durable power of attorney, then you're supposed to make sure you're taking care of the person who created it. So that document needs to have some leeway in it that says, you can deviate from the uniform principle and income tax act, where you have to have the most income and the most, value for the land, and you can make a donation. You can have those terms in there to give that person flexibility. And having the joint trustee is really helpful, in that case.
And we had an advance of her family, so it was just a little bit foresight. They had to know in the next 10 years, the likelihood is my mom would not be able to make these decisions on her own. So we did it when she was cognizant, the lawyer was there, the witnesses. So there's now nothing to be contested, by a family member. And that was it, it just activated until about 5 years later, when she finally said, I really don't want to stay with my mom here. And we tried how it didn't work. She said, I'd really like to go to care facility. And it was nice.
And the nice thing too is that you weren't litigating that. You weren't giving, I like to think the economy scale, you're trying to save the most money. So you do the trust, it may cost more than doing the will at this point, but it's going to be a lot cheaper later because you could probably manage most of the tasks in that trust on your own. You get a little bit of advice from the attorney, you might file a tax return, but you're not having to fill out court forms, you're not having a dispute because it's laid out in the trust, what, where things are going and what's supposed to happen and who's the trust.
We actually did have a little bit, there was some outside, a little bit outside, so we had to go. It was very small. And, it was very easy. I was the executor, and the courts were great working with me and just sort of saying, no, everything in the trust we don't care about. You just need to show us all the assets outside of it, which were just a few accounts.
That's a really good point. Some people think that if you have a trust, you don't have a will, you don't have to have probate. There's always going to be an asset that's going to be like a refund, a tax refund, maybe a rebate of some type, or a car that's not in the trust, then you do have to go to probate. But the fewer assets that have to go through probate, the easier the process is. You can have a voluntary administration. You have less than $25,000. It's very easy. It's cheaper to manage. One note on cars. Cars are my least favorite asset because it's kind of a pain. If you pass away and you have a surviving spouse, it's not as much of a deal. You can take the title to the RMV and just fill out the surviving spouse form. If you don't have a surviving spouse, you have to go through probate because of the car. I mean, it just seems crazy, but that's how it is. The one way you can deal with that ahead of time is you can take the title, you can sign it over to somebody now. That's something you can do and just put it in your safe deposit box and let your loved ones know where it is. But anyway, I just had too many small estates where we really only had a car and a couple of things, and either you leave the car to rot in the front yard, or you go ahead and open the probate so you can convey the car, donate it, or whatever you want to do. I did have another example of family where we have a farm. We've been in the community a long time, well-loved farm with really good corn. I give away who it is now, but the concern is, and they haven't come to me for estate plan, but I think of that as an example of the need for it. As you get older, if you don't have somebody who's going to be farming the land, it's going to end up having to be sold, or potentially having to be sold. If you don't have that income coming in. If you have a couple of individuals, and I don't know about this individual I'm thinking of, but as an example, if you had a couple of people who are farming land, they get to be in their 70s and they get to the point where they can't farm it anymore. They don't have a lot of assets because they were farmers. It's a very hard life that puts a lot of pressure on them and their family to sell that land, to take it out of APR and agricultural preservation, which which can be done. So it's good to have your estate plan done ahead of time. Look at conservation, look at working with the town to maybe make sure that they would not let the APR go away. If the town has money where they can make sure with the right of first refusal that they can buy that property, so much the better. So that's another plug. The CPA funds. Go ahead.
Can you clarify that? So I thought an APR, permanent restriction that state.
Oh, sorry, you're right. Thank you. You're right. 61A, I'm sorry, I got it mixed up. 61A, chapter land, right of first refusal, APR is permanent. Thank you for that clarification. Yeah, so I'm not sure. Yeah. But the chapter is not set in stone, unfortunately. So if you had it, let's say you had a couple of people who needed long-term care and they didn't have enough equity in their home, or maybe they wanted to try to not have the home have a lien on it and they want to sell a parcel, there's pressure on them to do that.
You just raised a great point about an elderly farmer who had their land is under chapter 61A, they've been trying it, but they can't fund it anymore, and there's pressure on them to sell that. But that is a great example that you could consider an agricultural conservation restriction. You could consider selling that development right is a form of conservation restriction, it's an agricultural restriction, and access that equity in their land for them to use now, but that farm is still intact. So that would be an example of how you can use conservation to access the equity.
Yeah. And we talked about, you saw on the other slides that you had presented earlier about the income tax savings. If you put land into, a conservation restriction and save on income taxes, but for an example, like I just gave, where you have elderly people, if I don't have a lot of income, it's not as helpful. There is a program called the Full Timber Income Fund for people who have forestry lands. It does allow you to have an income stream during your life. So this is particularly helpful for people where the conservation restriction may not be as beneficial to them because they don't have income to tax, to offset their income taxes, but they need the income stream. This is a program that the New England Forestry Foundation has. It's like an annuity, but it's not. They don't have anything like that for agricultural land, but that would be something that would be really nice if it was developed. So.
I think the summary for all of this is that it's never too early to start thinking about it and talking with your loved ones and about what you want to really do. Never too early. And even, I think just to give you perspective, the average, I would say, for the whole process of thinking about putting your land some sort of conservation years. I mean, very rare that something is less than 2 years that we're working on to put into conservation. So just start the conversation. There's no pressure to take any action or make any decisions. Just talk through what you're thinking. Start the conversation now. And just to zoom out a little bit more, that there's a lot. So state and federal funds it flows from the federal government to state, and states that build it out for water protection grants, the agricultural ENDAR. Anyway, there's a lot of money coming down the pipe. So there are opportunities for us to leverage to get some of those state federal funds increasing and so I just would say start those conversations as soon as possible with your loved ones and around the table and with partners, the town and our county or there's a lot of we can do others if you want to do forestry with forestry renovation or whatever. So that's I think that I just wanted to make that point. Never too early start.
Yeah, I think you want to slow the production grant, deadlines coming up. So it'll be not till next year,
Right.
Now basically we're working on, just not working on one, but we have for next year. So, something you're thinking about,
And the very last thing I'll say is check your beneficiary designations for your retirement and life insurance, because those will overrule anything in your trust or will. I mean, if you're considering making charitable donations to a land organization, for example, and you just, you can't do it as easily during your lifetime, you can name them as a beneficiary. The best thing to do is if you're going to do any charitable planning, using your beneficiary designations, use your retirement accounts, because when your heirs inherit your retirement account, that account is part of the estate for estate taxes, so it gets maybe taxed on that level. Plus, the person who's inherited it has to pay income taxes. They have to take it out unless it's a spouse within 10 years. So if you're making charitable donations from your beneficiary designated accounts, use your retirement because the charities don't pay. That's my last one.
And also, I mean, even at a scale or curve, is, you have, 50 or 100 acres and you want to keep a lot or two out for family, a son or daughter. Sometimes we can work with you, Fitchburg wants to protect the watershed, of course. If it's a lot with a stream to it, we probably want to see that develop, but we can also work with you on that. So of course, that's going to reduce the value of the property, but at the same time, sometimes you're going to have to put the whole thing in, but the survey can be done, a lot can be cut out, or something for family. We can still protect the rest of it too. So that's a possibility as well.
So, to turn it back over to Steve in a minute to close out, but I just wanted to see if there was any final questions for any of us here before I do, and also to let you know a couple of things. This has been recorded. We've given you a lot of information. Your heads may be spinning a little bit. This has been recorded, and you'll be able to access that on our website. And will you be emailing it to me?
Yes. Yes.
Website too. We have an open space committee, and they have a web page. We'll post it on their web.
So you'll be able to listen to all of this again. And also in the back, we have a number of handouts. There's a booklet about chapter 61. There's a booklet called Protecting Your Legacy, which will talk a lot about the conservation restrictions and the examples from different landowners about how they protected their land and what programs they used. It's just a really good summary. And there's information about North County Land Trust and the forestry program.
Sorry for one, but I have one.
And so before I give it back to Stephen, any more questions or? Great, well, thank you so much for the
Okay, folks, I hope you got a lot of good information today. Do take some of the handouts back with you. Think about what you heard today, and a couple months down the road, if you want to say, well, who was that water protection guy from Fitchburg? Who did you trust? If you don't remember their names, your contact info, just contact me in the planning department, and I'll hook you up there. Also, if you want to keep track of what's going on in town in terms of development, I keep a planning board mailing list for planning board agendas. If you want to get on that agenda mailing list, just contact me and I'll add you. You'll get the planning board agenda. We meet twice a month, second and fourth Tuesday of every month. So if you want to keep track of what's going on in town in terms of development, I highly suggest getting on that mailing list. And lastly, there'll be a vote towards the end of May whether or not the town should join the Community Preservation Act. I believe we've got some of the citizens sponsoring that act here. Is there a website that you can go to learn more about the CPA here in town?
I'm not familiar with the website. No, I know we have a few people.
And we can add any kind of information that you guys want to share in an email that we'll send to everyone as well. So any information or any links, we'll make sure you get.
So I encourage you to learn about the Community Preservation Act and what it means for Westminster. Thanks again for coming. Really.
one last thing, if any of you want us to come out and map your land, show you some of the resource values that there might be, and kind of talk about like, you know, any possibilities that we might see for your land, happy to do that, just reach out. And sometimes it's nice to see your land and like all of the different layers and all of the different conservation values that and the ways that the state has looked at how to value those application services. Happy to do that. Just reach out. Yeah. Thanks everybody for coming.